Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Inclusive Regency panel. My name is Laaleen Sukhera. I'm the founder of a community called the Jane Austen Society of Pakistan. I work in PR, and incidentally, I curated and co-wrote an anthology of contemporary fiction inspired by Jane Austen and set in Pakistani society called Austenistan. I am so delighted to be here today and to partner with Ananke to present to you this very important conversation. Inclusive Regency Narratives for the Digital Era, where our panel will discuss recent period drama in the context of ethnic representation, including Jane Austen and Bridgerton. And now I'd like to introduce you to each of our eloquent panelists who are also very active on social media. So after this session, please feel free to reach out to either of us or all of us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Amanda-Rae Prescott is joining us from New York. Hey, Amanda.
Hi, how are you?
So Amanda is a freelance pop culture journalist. Her articles reviewing period drama and other UK TV shows have previously appeared on Den of Geek, GBH Boston, Doctor Who magazine, and several podcasts. She is an outspoken advocate for increasing racial diversity in period drama fandom, as well as UK television and film. And we're moving basically from east to west here. So now we've got Amy Patterson in Ohio. Hi, Amy.
Hi.
An Austen fan since early childhood, Amy Patterson and her family operate Jane Austen Books, the world's only women-owned bookstore dedicated to books by and about Austen. Amy is also a contributing editor at Jane Austen's Regency World magazine, and her Austen-related writing has appeared across multiple digital and print publications, including The Joy of Jane. As a journalist based in Ohio's idyllic Amish country, Amy covers politics and education for the Geauga County Maple Leaf. Now over to the West Coast, we have Bianca Hernandez in San Francisco. Hi, Bianca.
Hey.
Social media mage by day and nerd of many fandoms by night, Bianca Hernandez is a lady of many interests and is well known for Drunk Austen, book hoarding, and cutting-edge podcasts. She works professionally in social media, managing brand marketing and audience engagement, and fights for a more inclusive Jane Austen community. And last but not least, over also on the West Coast, but towards the Canadian border in Washington State, we have Christina Boyd. Hi, Christina.
Good morning.
Whatever
time it is there.
Yeah, well, I'm in Pakistan and it's 8:48 p.m. So yeah, we've covered a few time zones here today. Christina wears many hats as she is a great reader, an editor under her own banner, the Quill Inc. LLC, a dedicated reviewer, and an artist. Since 2013, Christina has worked with over 30 authors, published 5 anthologies, and edited numerous contemporary and historical romance, chick lit, and Jane Austen-inspired novels. To date, she has edited 45 books in 7 years and is a life member of the Jane Austen Society of North America. So we have a lot of interesting things to discuss today, and we are going to be not only discussing period drama, but also recent ethnic representation and how we feel about it. And this is a very candid kind of conversation, and I think the first of many, and I'm just really, really proud to be part of this today. So thank you everybody for taking the time out to be here. Well, firstly, what is so special about the Regency era? What is the Regency era? What is the general public concept of it? I mean, all of us have grown up with Austen and Hare, and we're all well versed in it. But other people sort of sometimes mistake it for the Victorian era, for example. Is there more awareness now? And why are traditional regencies so appealing Why is there nostalgia for this 20-year period in history? How has it been shaped and by whom? So who would like to take this one? Christina?
Oh, good grief. Did I look like I really needed to start? For me, I was introduced to Austen when I was in high school, and actually it wasn't very interesting to me. I was more of Test of the D'Urberville, dark, that type of reading back then. But and it wasn't until the Joe Wright 2005 film of Pride and Prejudice that my sister dragged me to, and I actually thought, oh, I like this. And so then I went and I started reading the canon, and then I found fan fiction, and then I started writing reviews, and then Austen Prose approached me and asked if I would write reviews for them. Then a small press asked if I would edit for them, and so then I took off and opened my own, hung my own shingle. To me, I have always been attracted to historical fiction. I like the whole feel of it, the language, the politics, or the courtesies that of the time, or at least how it's presented in fiction. And I was not until reading about the upcoming movie back a few years ago about Belle did I actually realize, gosh, there were Black people in England.
You're talking about Belle, the period, the
Dido.
costume drama, and yes, and it was based on a real character.
And so for a real life person. And when I first started seeing the upcoming news about it, I thought this was a fictionalized character. Until I started reading about it and the press was coming about it. And to me, and then I was shocked to learn that there were, I don't know, if this, like 40,000 or 30,000 Black people living in London during time. And I because I just never read that just, I thought, well, then that's just a whole different idea of how I was starting to look at Regency. And then, but I never ever read anything else more about it. And being so much in Austen world, I always looked at the Regency as more of social classes, not racial social classes, but financial racial social classes. And I think mostly because Austen, she never really described characters, their features, or anything about them. I mean, for Lizzie Bennet, has fine eyes. Darcy, he's tall, mean, handsome. He's very vague about that, so that you can fill it in yourself. Maybe I'm just whitewashed by the whole thing, but I just looked at social differences as financial social differences. So the recent, even more so as it's coming about, that there were different cultures and colors of people in Regency England. It's been eye-opening for me as an editor, and I think that authors have a great opportunity to discover that, and even if they don't have that experience themselves, I mean, because no one has actually lived in Regency England. But if they do enough research, I think that there can be some really interesting fiction coming from that. That's was your original question.
Yeah, no, that's very insightful. I just want to quickly bring up here, like 20 years ago, I didn't even think I would come full circle like this. 20 years ago, I was sitting at college in Massachusetts, and I was doing an honors thesis. I was a screen studies major, and my honors thesis was about Englishness, constructing Englishness on screen, and that too Jane Austen adaptations. And one of the adaptations that I looked at, was Ang Lee's 1995 Sense and Sensibility, and he's Taiwanese. And I drew parallels at that time. And I thought, Englishness is not something that needs to be constructed just by white English people, actually. Other people actually do a really good job because they have much more culturally in common with that era. So yeah, I feel like we've come full circle. The next question, and also I was wondering, would anyone like to add to this? And do you think there's an age gap in the general public conception of the Regency?
I think you actually have a really good point about like how different communities and cultures and ethnicities view the Regency and like their perspectives, especially now, because for me, I really love, Sonia Kamal's Unmarriageable. I really enjoyed it. And I think that also there's a really interesting perspective from folks that are closer to colonialism, that their families, their culture, their entire lives have had much more recent shaping and much more vast shaping by colonialism, by powers, either British or not, but like in that Western space. And I think that, like, for me, I think there's a really interesting point that you have about sensibility and like the constructions of Englishness by people that are not white and British, but by people who have been impacted by those things. And I think that's what's really fresh and interesting to me, because when you read Austen, yes, ostensibly these are things about social commentary and class. And I'd argue that a lot of white people in Western societies, America specifically, are like, we don't have classes. And I think for many of us that are not white, we actually really can see the lines there, the invisible lines of class. And I think that's why, people come to Austen and these things for various reasons, right? Their relatability. But I think for so many of us, especially women of color, we come to this with like, oh, it may not be talking to race, but like the discussion of classes and dynamics between who you can and cannot marry, who you can and cannot be in society with, those, and like how we judge people by where they're born and who they're born under, those are real for a lot of us. And I think that's really interesting and wonderful, and how authors of color are trying to own this and make this in its own space. Because if you're reading it, maybe you're here for the romance, and that's great for you. But I think, or you're here for the quips, or you're here for, the interesting nods to Napoleonic Wars or whatever. But I think what's really enjoyable is like what fans are able to do, because we see ourselves in the text, even though it's 200 years old. And that, I think, is what keeps us there. We've all met a Thorpe. We've all met like a Mr. Thorpe or a Mr. Collins, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and, I came at it from a very different place than Christina. My mom read Pride and Prejudice to me and my sister when I was like 3, and she did all the voices, but she was also reading us like the kind of the American canon. And she, I love my mom. She was one of these white moms who like took us to Black churches and, read us all these really, she's, social justice kind of oriented, which we grew up in a multicultural neighborhood. We were the white kids on our block, and the kids around the corner who were white spoke a different language at home. And not that gives me, street cred or something, which some people try to use it that way. It's more like it allowed me to see how other people see the world at like 5 years old, where some people don't get that until they're an adult. And so coming up with Jane Austen as this extra language on top of English, of American English, I was able to have a language for people like John Thorpe, and then we witnessed this thing through the bookstore or through, Jane Austen groups, where people start out, they read one novel, and then they want to read another novel, and then they finish all the novels, and then they read all the juvenilia, and then they read the scholarship. And then all of a sudden they do what Christina did. They go, I had no idea that there were Black people in London, or I had no idea that there was a purge of Jewish people living in the city. They had no idea. And then they go back and they read the novels again, and they see her talking about colonialism and Sense and Sensibility. They see her talking about Colonel Brandon going to the East Indies, and how maybe that reference is important when he's talking about Eliza. And then they go back and read Jane Austen's biography, and they see maybe that reference is important when Jane Austen's talking about her cousin Eliza. So it becomes this lifelong, you're pulling these threads. And this one woman who lived 200 years ago, we have, so coming from this background of like having a mom who raised me to see the world as what I do affects this entire constellation of people in my life, I think that's the background I see Jane Austen in, and it can be overwhelming. It's like, I can't escape it. But at the same time, I think if more people maybe approach it that way, instead of just, it's a nice story and let's just leave it at that. Let's not get into it, and I'm sorry, but you can't not get into it. Like you can't just say, we're not going to talk about it,
I mean, and on that note too, I hate to be this person, but like in a lot of those spaces where people want to deep dive on stuff, I'm like, okay, so we are going to say we can spend 4 hours talking about how the Reformation impacted Northanger Abbey, but we can't talk about how Black people existed in London. Like how, you know what I mean? So like for me, the frustration in certain spaces, not all, but certain spaces of the community is when people are like, well, we can't talk like race, but talking of race is racism. And I'm like, no, acknowledging that people existed is the bare minimum we can do right now when the history has been so immensely whitewashed. And when Austen adaptations, I would argue, have also been immensely whitewashed, especially.
And she was talking about race explicitly. If you know if you know the history, she was explicitly referencing race in multiple books in multiple places. Like it's not
Sanditon.
For me,
Mansfield Park.
For me, as a Afro-Caribbean woman growing up in America, like I have that colonialist connection that other folks don't have, because my family came from Trinidad and Tobago and they immigrated to America in the 60s. They made a pit stop in England, of course, in that journey. But for me, I connected. My gateway to Austen was everything on PBS that aired. Starting, I didn't watch because 95 Austen didn't originally air on PBS, but eventually I got to watch it. The 95 PMP, I was saying, but yeah, it was sort of seeing those characters in the world, and I'm realizing people like me had to be there. I know it because I come from like my relatives, our ancestors were there at some point, and like we have to be in the story somehow. And it wasn't oddly enough until I started watching Doctor Who of all things, which half the time they have period episodes where the Doctor and the companions go back in time. And they've made more strides to be inclusive in casting in their period set stories that it just makes it, until Bridgerton and Sanderson came along, this makes that it didn't, I'm like, where is this diversity within on screen in official Austen works? Because obviously, Doctor Who, half the time they're just fighting aliens, but it wasn't until, and I actually started researching for myself Black British history and reading the scholarship and realizing, hey, this stuff on screen is clearly not reflecting what's the history. And the problem is that so many people have been shaped by those whitewashed movies and TV shows that now they're realizing that they have to unlearn all the history that was not taught to them. The history that they've been taught 20, 30, 40 years ago is wrong. And that struggle to get people to unpack their armchair history and learn the real stuff, it's in some cases it turns into I don't want to talk about it, because it's like have to unlearn what they've constructed, the knowledge they've constructed for themselves.
And I think we have this tendency, especially in America, to think that because we live now, we're automatically better than people who lived back then. Because we have flush toilets in our houses, like we can't be, as bad as they were. And we have very much moved into more, our schools are more segregated than ever. Our white supremacy is very visibly on the rise in a lot of areas. And
in a lot of countries, there's a lot of supremacy movements, in fact.
Right. So to say like, our history can't be inaccurate. And we had a Black woman who came with a friend to a Jane Austen event a few years ago, and she told the story about she went to a costume event, and someone said to her, well, why are you here? You can't be dressed up like this. If you had been, back then, you would have been a slave. And she was like, God. And ridiculous. How could you say that to somebody, first of all? And I just, it's wrong. It's factually incorrect. And like, the idea that somebody has the right to, I don't know. I don't even know if I should have said that just now, but like, it's so horrifying that people think they have the right to not only decide that they can say something like that to you, but that they can decide what your past would have been. I don't know. I don't even know how to conceptualize how bad that is, but like, sorry. I
totally agree. People's histories need to be treated with more respect than that. And it's just cringe-worthy at best.
And I think too, it's gatekeeping, because like in those fantasy spaces of like, I think part of this conversation about Regency, right, is the narratives around the fantasy spaces of Regency, right?
Thank you.
Like we can get into like the Bridgerton thing in a second, but like especially historical costuming, like we are ostensibly all there to frolic in wonderful things that we've made and have fun in. But that's definitely, racism is one of the pillars of gatekeeping in those spaces, because it's like using the excuses of the past to keep people of color down. And I'm like, but why is this an okay fantasy for white people to be in here, right? Like, why is it okay for white people to be frolicking in these wonderful French court gowns, but a person of color, how dare they? And it's like, I'm sorry, but like, not all of y'all would have been frolicking. Like, not all of y'all are descendants of royalty.
A lot of, and sorry, just to cut in for a second, a lot of the fashions at that time came from my part of the world. I mean, the fabrics, the shawls, the jewelry, and we still dress like that to a great extent, even in the summer. So that's one thing I always found kind of interesting. And a friend, actually, she's a journalist, Catriona Luke, she wrote this essay on Jane Austen and the East India Company, and how the publication of Pride and Prejudice actually was linked to, the empire from this part of the world. So there's so many links that people are just not aware of.
Well, and just willfully,
my 2 cents.
Or just willfully ignorant of, because I think, again, like it's one of those things, if you read Austen, you read closely and you see even annotated editions, because she makes references we wouldn't know in modern parlance, but like when you are living under a colonial power, you are very much influenced by all the countries that your colonial power is interacting with, because that's how money is made, that's the trade, that's all of these things, and that's what influenced fashion. That's how those things, it's just fascinating, because to me, especially the historical costuming space, I'm like, that to me is a bigger leaf of why are we gatekeeping who can have the fantasy? Much like I think when we get to the Bridgerton discussion, we can talk about more, but for me too, it's the Bridgerton thing where people are upset, and I'm like, but why? Like, there have always been these Regency romances that were 100% fantasy. These people did not exist. I hate to tell you that. That Duke did not exist.
And they did not have perfect teeth. That's fantasy.
Right.
They did not have push-up bras. They had corsets. That's fantasy.
Somebody like, in a past life, I was a princess. I was Cleopatra. I was Marie Antoinette.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, and if there were past lives, I was like, I typhus. Like, I was not, I was a scullery maid. I did not have servants, So
yeah, I would have been in Parda, so I wouldn't have been here.
Like, I'm gonna play that I'm, whatever, right? So, but nobody else can. Yeah, I think this whole, like you said, this fantasy world, and like this is where like the plantation weddings thing comes in too. Like that's to me that was always like a huge red flag. Like if the biggest day of your life and your idea is let's have it at a plantation, I'm like, what is that? Like that's a giant red flag to me. I'm sorry, and I think people sometimes go into these things, and when you're raised in a culture and surrounded by people where this is normal, and I'm not trying to excuse it, but I understand, like you've never been asked to question this. So now if you did that, if you're questioning it, I'm not telling you that you need to beat yourself up for the rest of your life, but like look back and say, oh, now I understand why maybe people are upset with me for doing that. That doesn't mean that you're a horrible person. It means now you know better and you will do better. And if someone comes to you and says, should I have my wedding at a plantation? Say, even though I did, you probably shouldn't. Like when we know better, we do better, right?
Yeah. I think that's also the minimum of some of the conversations I see cascading online around these adaptations, right? I think that like some people are like, you know what? I'm going to do that research. I'm going to read up on it. Or I read this, like all the people who like are suddenly reading up on like Black Londoners. Great. I'm stoked that we're going to have these conversations. We're going to be talking about this, I think, especially in future adaptations for a lot of periods around British history. I'm glad that this is going to be a thing at the forefront. But the people who get upset immediately and get defensive, and I'm like, all I hear is these accuracy arguments, especially, Wentworth, the new Wentworth casting and the new Persuasion. And I'm just like, when I hear these accuracy arguments that are very easily debunked, very easily, all I can think is, this is really telling me more about that person's uncomfortableness with their own internalized racism. And I think that to me is a part of, in this community space, you know, especially people who are like always like, Bianca, what can I do? How do I do, you know, better as an ally in this space? And I'm like, literally just call these people out on their stuff, because when we have people saying, oh, a Black man could have never done this, never, ever, all these things. And I'm like, I mean, Black people existed. Just letting you know, if we have to have that conversation, bare minimum, they existed. They lived in the UK at that time. That would have been a thing. And then also, you know, giving them the like actual, like, hey, The Black Count is a wonderful book. It's about Alexander Dumas' father. Also, letting people know that Alexander Dumas was a Black man. Like, he is of Black descent. These famous people, these narratives, sometimes, again, when people are talking about Austen and how, oh, but it would have just been all white. She never would have seen a person of color. No. And also, part of this is understanding that we've been delivered these whitewashed versions of history. The amount of people who don't know that Alexander Dumas was a man of Black descent is one of those things. His father he was a major part of the Napoleonic Wars. And that's why Dumas wrote about the Regency era so well and so deeply, because he was writing about and to his father. But a lot of people were just like, I didn't know that. Whoops. And I'm like, I mean, if we want to have these deep conversations, it takes literally sometimes one Google search to find out. If you're going to be...
Yeah, there's no excuse anymore.
There's no excuse. Yeah. But I think too, like, in these community spaces, those are the conversations where I'm just like, if we're going to have them and people are uncomfortable dealing with their racism, just keep spewing those facts back at them. Like, keep debunking them, because that's really all we can do. And also just create safer spaces for folks. But if you're uncomfortable being confronted with, like, why are people of color in my fantasy space? That's a bigger reflection of you than it is of the people who are enjoying the space.
I'm going to just take a very quick moment here, and then we will continue this discussion. Of course, we still have a bit of time. I'm going to just show our audience just a few photos so that they know what we're talking about when we talk about period drama. So here we go. There was a short film on YouTube adapted from a Regency novel called Mr. Malcolm's List, which is now going to be a feature-length film. And you can see the cast is ethnically diverse. There's Frida Pinto, there's Gemma Chan. I mean, this was the cast in the short film, so the feature-length film has a slightly different cast. And then, of course, we have Sanditon. Sanditon here has an heiress who is not white. It just lasted for one season, and she was a prominent character, and it is the first Jane Austen adaptation that has actually featured somebody who is not white. Am I correct? Has there been any other character? I don't recall. And then of course we have, sorry?
Yeah, no one that's as featured as her.
Okay, so that was, sorry, I'm just going to scroll down a bit. And then we've got Emma, which is, of course, very, very beautiful, but also very white. This came out last year. And then we have, I would call this a historical moment, Bridgerton. Bridgerton has changed everything. Not only do friends now ask me for period drama lists, friends who used to make fun of me before for being obsessed with Mr. Darcy, they're like, hey, can you recommend some period drama? Because everyone's like, wow, this is really sexy. And, casting is so much more fun now, especially when we dream cast people. And speaking of casting, the new Persuasion's Captain Wentworth is Joel Fry. And yes, there was a bit of a mixed reaction, which I would love for you all to actually, share your opinions on. There was a bit of a mixed reaction on some fandom sites. Who would like to take this one up?
I'll take this one. It was immediately, I knew hell was coming when they announced his name, because a lot of the times too, one of the problems I have with some of these spaces is that as a journalist, I'm keeping up with what people are doing elsewhere. Some of these folks are watching the same DVDs they watched from 20 years ago, and they're not realizing that there's new people coming into the industry. There's new people who are making their marks on in UK TV or in UK movies that they're not watching because they only watch, or either they only watch Austen things, they only watch period dramas, or they only watch whatever PBS can curate, and then therefore they're like, who's this Joel Fry guy? And I'm like, well, he was in a Netflix movie last year. He was in a Netflix movie last year. He was great. Other things. Yeah, like Love, Wedding, Repeat was hysterical. I'm like, look, I'm like, these are the people they're going to be drawing from for future adaptations. They're not going to be picking your faves from 20 years ago because they're aged out of the roles. Yeah, like that's another thing too. It's not just racism; it's the ageism angle too. It's like they're not paying attention to the industry. They're not watching UK crime and modern drama to see who people are. It's like that's the other thing. They're like, that's where a lot of the he looks too young comments came from. It wasn't just race. It was a sort of that's a huge factor though, because I mean Joel Fry is of African descent and they're judging him by white beauty standards, but still the age is another issue too, because you have folks often you can't tell how old someone is on social media, but a lot of times when they say stuff like I don't know, I've never heard of them before, I'm like, IMDb's right there. You've never heard them or never seen them before because you're not looking for what younger actors are watching. It's just a fact. Like that's what struck me the most about these comments of like, did you see him in that Netflix movie last year? It was pretty widely promoted, y'all.
Yeah, it was a great movie.
It was a great movie, and it started, and I was shocked too because like it starred at least two well-known folks from previous period drama. I mean, Eleanor Tomlinson and Jack Farthing are well-known from Poldark, and nobody was checking for them. And I'm like, I'm like, y'all were. It's like, you guys claim you're such a huge fan of these actors, and yet you're not following their new projects to see what they're up to. And I'm like, that's very telling. And the other people that I cast have gone on to do other things as well. So I'm like, that was part of, for me as an entertainment journalist, looking at a lot of these reactions. A lot of this stuff just comes down to people curated their own world, not just a fantasy, but of news and what they consider news. That's why a lot of the same thing with Sanditon happened again. They keep claiming a second season's happening, according to whom? People.
It's not.
It's not happening. And I've also been on the forefront of debunking a lot of fake news that goes around fandom, because it's like, who is saying that? Like one random thing that wasn't, one casting notice that wasn't deleted in UK trades from last year pre-coronavirus. Like that's the thing too. These communities they don't just curate views on racial issues. They curate what other people hear about in terms of productions and new things as well. They don't realize that this diversity thing is not a trend. It's been going for years, and it did not just start with Bridgerton. Actually, the real source of changing the game in this genre is actually Hamilton. Hamilton, Hamilton really broke that whole thing down. Like, why can't we not have POC playing? And especially since Hamilton's technically a biopic or bio stage production, it's like these are Black people and Hispanic people playing white characters. Like that before anything else has to be considered, even though it's not. That's the other thing too. A lot of times people are looking for things only within the era. You have to look outside Regency era because it's a Georgian production. Well, at least Georgian according to UK standards. You know, that Revolution era, it's the same. The 18th century productions are just as, they're pushing the envelope as well. Harlots, and even the last season of Poldark featured an interracial couple in the abolitionist movement. I mean, that was the Despards. A lot of people were like, "Oh my God, they just made that up." No, there's a whole biography, and actually half of another biography about the villain in that story. He has his own biography too. I'm like, there was evidence there. Y'all just never heard of it because nobody saw it.
They didn't look it up. They should have looked it up.
Exactly.
There's no excuse.
There's no excuse. It's like you guys. That's the thing too. It's like a lot of the conversation in this community is just because people have curated what they want to hear about this era, not just in terms of history, but in terms of like news as well. It's like this has been going on for a while, you guys. Like, it's like this is a thing. It's a trend, and it's not a trend actually. It's going to continue. Even because even in period drama fandom, people even realize that Hamilton immediately influenced another period drama to have a civil rights character added into their story, which is actually Grantchester, which is technically is a crime drama. Grantchester screenwriter Daisy Coulomb was like, "Oh yeah, I was inspired by Hamilton to include that character in the exit story for Sydney Chambers." I'm like, "Yeah, that wasn't in the books because she was by Hamilton." It was not.
I
It was
would
not
know
original.
that's what inspired it. Okay, nice.
Yeah, I actually, because I've written quite a few Bridgerton reviews, and I brought that up, and people did not realize. I'm like, yeah, the dots are there. You just got to connect them. The evidence and the receipts are there for why we're at the point we are now, and it's. I mean, even things like the personal history of David Copperfield, which is a Victorian piece, but Dev Patel as the titular character, all that stuff this is going on.
What you just said about Grantchester, that blows my mind. I'm so happy to hear that. But I mean, what she did is she really took the time period and what was happening at the time and made that relevant. So I love that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I didn't even know that.
These people,
I can't wait to tell more people.
You talk about these people who sort of self-select into these social media bubbles, but what the other thing that I see happening, it's kind of this thing that happens where people are self-selecting these bubbles, but then they spill over into other spaces. People aren't paying attention to where they are, and I think that's the big problem. And I know Laaleen said we're all very active on social media, but part of the reason I'm not very active is because I have a hard time sometimes figuring out where I am in a public space, because sometimes I'm thinking I'm in a conversation, like I understand someone who's got a PhD in historical clothing being like, you know, it's important, like that BBC article that just went around about the how the British colonializing, you know, killed that special Dhaka muslin industry. That's a really important article. And I can understand someone saying, hey, you know, we need to talk about this, and the clothing in Bridgerton, you know, if you like that, you should really want to know how England killed this fabric. Okay, that's a really cool conversation. But if you're going to barge into a space where people are like, I want to look like the girls look in Bridgerton, I want to make costumes, I don't care that they're not made out of period accurate muslin. If you're barging into that space, then you're doing, you know, what Bianca talks about with gatekeeping. And I think people really have a hard time because that scholar has been in this bubble where they're talking about, you know, historically accurate clothing. And so if they accidentally step into this other world or intentionally step into this other world, you know, I think that stuff happens a lot, and we don't always know. And sometimes people do know and they're purposely doing it. But I think people need to respect and honor the spaces they're in. And again, sometimes that's a conscious choice that they're doing. They're going after other people and saying, you should. Like, there are films I don't like. And my sister and I might get catty about it, but I'm not going to barge into a fan space and say, I hate this film because of this. You know, I might say, well, I kind of laughed at this part, and I might joke about it, but I don't care if someone else likes it. That's not my business. But if we're going to sit down and have a conversation with a scholar about why it's important that this scene was changed, or why it's important that this person is sending a signal in the film by wearing this kind of clothes, that's a different conversation. And people just don't pay attention on social media to those things, and they really need to, because otherwise they're taking over spaces. And like you said, they're just not, they're you know, covering, they're barging into conversations where they're not, you know, they're too old. I don't want to say too old, sorry, because I'm pretty getting close to that label myself. So Bianca told me once, don't ever tell anybody your age. So I'm just going to say, at least I know what IMDb is.
And I think that's really important too. I've seen in these spaces when people are excited about something, whether it is the Wentworth casting of Joel Fry or it is Bridgerton, people starting posts or threads about how they love it, and other people coming in to be like, well, I hated it. And I'm like, I don't care. I don't care. You're not, like, this is not about that. Why do you feel the need to let everybody know that you hate something? I don't know. There are a lot of things that I don't like in the world, and I've still found my experience better by not having to ruin it for everybody else, right? I think too, though, in these conversations about like centering, like in the conversations about kind of having like curated, aka like your safe space, your fantasy all white history space, I think too, part of this conversation, I think that's where the muddying of like academics not kind of understanding and reading the room is. As much as I love historical, like people who can deep dive on historical costume and Jane Austen, I'm like, when we shifted Bridgerton, this is a different conversation. This is really a conversation for stage and screen production folks. And I'm not just saying that because I have a background. I'm saying that because that background helps me understand like the budgetary and like visions of making a big screen production and making those costumes, making those casting choices are 100% different than if you are trying to do an independent study and making your own, you know, handmade 100% accurate costume or whatever you're doing. Those are two different things. I'm sorry. I totally respect people and their expertise, but I'm also like, in those conversations where we're talking about why a screen adaptation chose what it did, that's a totally different level and space. And I think too, that is a really important conversation because especially casting choices, those feed into the bigger understanding of who is the market for this. And I think with Bridgerton, a lot of folks who've never had themselves not be centered were very upset not to see themselves centered in that story and their fantasy centered in that story. And I think that's what I saw and heard from a lot of resistance there about like, well, I didn't like it because, and I'm like, you didn't like it because it wasn't centered toward your fantasy. And the big thing that I see and is a problem is there are tons of white-centered fantasy stories out there. White-centered romances, white-centered Austen things. This is the first of, I hope, many stories on the big screen or small screen that center people of color because we haven't had ourselves centered. Like, I've never seen an adaptation of a half Salvadoran girl, and I'm never going to see that because probably in my lifetime, because we are not very popular apparently in on-screen adaptations that are not about trauma. And I think that's another thing too. People of color, usually we're only featured in things about traumatic events.
Yes. Why is that? Why do we have to suffer all the time and explain why we're there? Whether it's fiction or anything, in fact. Why does there have to be that element? I mean, love and romance, I mean, comedy, these are universal elements. Does it really matter?
And I think to be inclusive and representative of, and fairly, writers, they have an opportunity, directors, filmmakers, they have an opportunity now to help change that stereotype right there. And I don't mean change history or reinvent history, but rather to look at it, people's cultures from a different perspective, and to truly take a look around them and see around them, and not just put other cultures that are not Anglo white people in major roles or even tertiary or secondary roles that are not negative characters. They need to put them more in a positive light because that's what you see now. And I feel like they have an opportunity right then to be able to change a perspective. And I think it's important that people see themselves, different cultures, if they're, for me, different culture, half, mixed American, all, the American mutt, that's me. I feel like to be able to see different cultures, to see me as a character in a book, or to see others, people of color in a book, I'm able to make a connection to the world that's not necessarily in my own community that I grew up in. So I feel like that's important. And I feel like authors right now, directors, they have a great opportunity to be able to do that, but not just put a person of color in there as a token person. I think that's vital also. I mean, you need to be able to not just like shoehorn somebody in just because that's the thing.
And there's a real problem with the white gaze. And I think the white gaze is present in literature and media all the way. I mean, it's not new. And and this is something that happens even on social media. I've seen it happen with activists who are people of color, when they spend all day doing work, doing labor, doing emotional labor, doing actual labor, and then they post something that's full of joy, and someone gets on there and is like, hang on, why aren't you analyzing this? Why aren't you deconstructing this? You need to answer questions for me. And it's like, you know what? Everybody
explain it. Yeah.
Right. And I think it's just, not every single story about a person of color has to be, they overcame great distress. Like, if I can see this and I'm just some white lady from Cleveland, like, why can't directors see this? Like, they make millions of dollars. And like, I think Bianca has talked about this online before, like, what audiences are they interacting with? Because they're getting letters from fans, they're getting ratings. And it seems like, I remember this thing, and this isn't even about people of color, this is about women. There was the Sherlock Holmes sister, and like, everybody loves Sherlock Holmes' sister. And they're like, we're thinking about making a new spinoff about Sherlock Holmes the guy. And I'm like,
yeah.
like, who are they?
That was hilarious.
So
that was hilarious.
That's the
I couldn't stop laughing.
Here's the thing too.
I remember when Black Panther came out, you know, Black Panther, it was like, nobody will want to see a movie about Black people living. And, you know, growing up where I grew up, I was very aware that Africa was full of cities. Like, and I went to college, and people are telling me, like, there's no cities in Africa. So, you know.
And then Africa has so many countries. It's like referred to as one country.
Africa's not a single.
That kills me.
There are countries
annoying.
in Africa. They have cities, they have highways, they have the internet, like, and people in
skyscrapers.
There are so many people in America who don't even know these things. And so when Black Panther came out, I mean, people were like shocked that there's that there's Black people in the city. And I'm like, what the heck? And
my God.
And a studio thought that people wouldn't even like to see this movie, you know, and it's like one of the biggest movies ever made, you know, and I think that white audiences are, on the one hand, underestimated, and on the other hand, like, overestimated. So I don't even know how those decisions get made. I don't know how they should get made, because I look around and I see when people do make those decisions, they're great. They make a ton of money. You know, they turn out really well. But on the other hand, I look around at my neighbors sometimes and I think maybe they won't, because some of these people just are not, you know, I don't know. Just going through the world with the white gaze. No.
The industry right now, though, is in flux, because out of the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement has come a call for marginalized creators to become part of the picture. But here's the thing. Here's the important thing you think of. Mr. Malcolm's List, Bridgerton, Sanditon, all of that stuff is not Hollywood. It's coming from the UK. And the UK has the population rate that I don't remember off the top of my head. It's probably at best between 6 and 8% of African descent or something like that. It is nowhere near. It is nowhere near the U.S. population. So that's just, I'm just talking about people of African descent. I'm not even going to get into when you break down the numbers of the various Asian cultures, Middle Eastern cultures, like all of that, all those numbers are skewed. And there are very few Black screenwriters, Black content creators, Black directors, anything else behind the screen. I mean, this is something just came out. I mean, Christiana Eversong Green is directing 2 episodes of Outlander, and she's the first Black director on Outlander, period. Like, nobody else has ever. And this is the new season. And he was like, wait, what? I'm like, yeah, she's the first out of how many people directed on the show. It's like, even having her in the industry in the UK is rare. Like, there's only. And also too, a lot of the problem with diversifying the pure genre space is that the Black content creators in England do not want to have been told for years, you don't look like an Austen character, so you can't be in a period drama, or they don't want to represent colonialism. It's like Idris Elba has refused to be in a period drama for years and years because of that issue. And his content creation is all contemporary drama, and that's the thing. There's so few people screenwriting of color, and even the British period pieces that are focused on Asia, like most of those writers are white. Like, I mean, we had, because even something as simple as A Suitable Boy, it was based on Vikram Seth's novel, but Andrew Davies, who wrote Sanditon, wrote the screenplay with Vikram Seth consulting, because that's the problem. Even the views of those people, I mean. Another production about Asia, the Singapore Grip, which actually has not aired in America yet, it was based on a white man's novel.
Okay.
It's called The Samurai Grip. It was on ITV last year. I saw it because I like to sneak peek things. But again, all those views of people of color are not from those cultures. And it's because the industry, there is no such thing in the UK as BET. There is no Tyler Perry. Like all those black media spaces, there's no Essence magazine, there's no Jet magazine, none of that stuff is there. People have to build it from the ground up. And that's
True.
Why so much of this conversation is skewed, because I don't think Americans understand that, because we're so used to having Black and Latinx spaces in media and Hollywood knowing historical racism and having to at least attempt to disturb that precedent. In England, all the decision makers are white. They have to chip away at things slowly, but it's a much slower process for chipping away at things.
England needs Shonda, a Shonda, basically.
Exactly. They need it. Yeah, that's the thing. They don't, even the people who are trying to do that, they still have massive, massive issues. Like Michaela Cole, who did I May Destroy You, even though it's a modern piece, she had to fight Netflix she left Netflix because they wouldn't give her a fair share of her content. She had to go strike up with Warner Brothers and HBO as a result. They wouldn't, and she had to go, even for basic stuff, she had to fight them. And there's some other folks struggling out there too. That's where we have to go. It's sort of, as fans, supporting the people who are doing more than just performative labor. The folks, like, if you look at which production companies and who people are hiring, like, that's the kind of where you need to, and what they're coming out with. Are they coming out with more of the same whitewashing? Are they pushing back against, this is another angle too in the UK, especially, it's become politicized and not in a good way, because you have people who want to defund the BBC and defund the arts. They're complaining about seeing people of color on screen. And that's where all that conversation's leading to. They don't want these things funded. They don't want people to have jobs. They don't want stories to be seen. They only want the same old stuff. And that's why we need to push back against that in fandom. We have to support people who are trying to actively fight the trolls and push back on these things. Because trust me, the industry already probably has a feeling toward this advancing things. Like, for example, with a lot of the things that came out of Bridgerton, you had people who are like, where are the Caribbean heiresses that are written by POC? Like, there are projects probably already starting to that. There is a Haitian Revolution period piece that's coming out. They don't have a distributor yet, but Mammoth Screen, who did Poldark, is working on it.
Wow.
Like 10 years ago, they wouldn't have done that. Like,
never. Not even like 3 years ago. Yeah.
Exactly. But now people are realizing this is a thing. But of course, they have to. Of course, there's so much industry racism that has to be unpacked, and as fans, how we can help the folks who are trying to push against the tide is by confronting these things in fandom and supporting the projects that are diverse. Like, because here's the thing, what people don't realize, Bridgerton will spawn a whole bunch of ripoffs or inspired buys. People want to make that money. They may not have Netflix's budget, but they're gonna try.
Yeah.
And that's the good thing. It's like, and the only problem is that some of these folks are in the UK, so they're not going to be looking at American authors writing diverse stories, because it's an American perspective versus a UK perspective. So it's sort of where we have to fight is essentially proving to the UK that there's an international audience for things. Because sometimes it doesn't work all the time, but they realize that they can make money after licensing outside of the UK. That's where stuff's going to happen. Like, there have been a bunch of white productions that have only been made because they made money overseas. And PBS is also part of that equation as well, in terms of like, it did really well on PBS. We're just gonna keep making more seasons of this. Okay, because we can, even if we lose money in the UK, we can make money outside of it after.
Yeah. International co-productions solve a lot of these issues. It just takes a leap of faith. And when it comes down to it, this business is all about money. And because Hamilton and Bridgerton have made so much money, I mean, there's no reason why you mentioned Black Panther. I mean, there's no reason why there shouldn't be so much more out there. And Amanda, you actually mentioned, like, this was going to be my last question, and you actually already started on that, so that's fantastic.
Sorry.
No, that's great. My last question was, well, we are over time, so what can audience members do to support diverse period drama, visual media, and authors, both on the screen and fictional? in fiction? What can we do? And what can our communities do? For example, readers, audiences, what can we do to support this? And one more thing, this is an interesting question. Can a white person write a story about a person of color and still be authentic to the work? How does that work? The cultural sensitivity angle, the authenticity angle, whether it's a novel or a script.
I mean, when it comes to a script, I think for me, it's always like, please have people of color in the room. Please have them actually be heard. I think, that's always going to be the issue with Sanditon. As much as people are like, look, representation. I'm like, no, that's not, especially because there weren't people in the writer's room helping make those choices be intentional. If you just throw somebody in the room for like a writer's room, but you don't listen to them, like you've not only tokenized them, you've now been performative and you aren't listening. So I think like for those things, like support those things. Ask folks why there aren't people of color in the room for certain things. Like be that person. If you wanna do this, it's not just in front of the camera, it's behind the scenes too. For the on-screen, small and big screen. I'd say even look at your local theaters. Like theaters have been doing diverse and blind casting for a long time. I'd say like invest some time in thinking about like your local arts programs are the ways that like, especially post-pandemic, you can support things that have been doing the diverse work. These are just little ways, especially because I think about like how many people do school trips and like that's sometimes your first exposure is an on stage little like, my local theater did the production of whatever this book is, and that's why we're reading it. Anyway, I think like supporting those things on whatever level you can, because I think people are like, sometimes the big Hollywood is too big to, to think that you can overcome. But I'm like, there's little things locally. Authors, supporting the authors. A Duke, a Lady, and a Baby by Vanessa Riley is one of those books that is diverse of Regency era. Like support authors that are doing this work, authors of color. And as far as being like a white author trying to write about other ethnicities, one, ask yourself, like, what is your intent? I think the biggest thing for me is always like, are you just using people of color to sell your book? And I could name so many titles that have done this. Or, are you just respectfully, just saying, hey, I'm going to include people of color because that's just the world I live in? If you're trying to include ethnicities and cultures that you know nothing about, I'd say, do all of your research. Like if you're going in this with good intent and not just, I want to make sure that I'm checking off a box, go like, you can't do this intentionally and well and authentically if you're just doing it to check a box. Do your research, pay people. If you're asking people from those communities to talk to you, pay them for their time to educate you on the things that you don't understand. Just like I would pay anyone like for their knowledge on like a specific thing, especially if I'm going to use that on a thing that I'm going to make money off of. Thank them, put them in acknowledgements. Also have sensitivity readers, have people read your stuff after you've written it, have them integral, not just when you're like, I'm done with my final draft. Have these people and pay them and keep them as part of the process. If you want to do that work, I'd also say on the other hand too, if you are like, you know what, maybe it's not my place, but I have a platform to promote authors or upcoming writers or whatever, use that space, use that power. I think that like, you don't have to be Rick Riordan, but I do think that like he has done phenomenal work in the writing space to be like, I've learned, he acknowledges when he's made mistakes and he talks about when he's learned and how he's learning and how he's trying to do better. And I think, we don't have to like give little like gold stars to all white men who decide to do better. But I think like, as far as just, there are gracious ways to acknowledge that you've not been perfect all the time and that you've made mistakes in your previous writing. And I think a lot of folks feel authenticity from writers who acknowledge that versus try to just cover it up and make excuses and get defensive. And also what he's done is he's used his massive platform to have a whole like sub publishing set that it's a Rick Riordan Presents, and it's all people of color. It's all writers of color getting to write wonderful stories that center themselves and their communities. And I think if you're an author that has any kind of platform, I don't care if you have just 2,000 people on your subscriber list or followers or whatever, if you can't do the work, if you don't maybe have the knowledge or whatever, but these are things you could do today. Like retweeting authors of color it just takes 2 seconds. Like, those are the minimum things you could do.
That was fantastic. Does anyone have anything else to add? Would anyone like to add anything quickly?
In terms of community spaces, I think one huge thing that would help folks like us in these spaces is if you can ask people if they're saying something about problematic about diversity issues, hey, why did you say that? Or I don't understand. Because sometimes you have people who are willfully ignorant, or the people who are just outright trying to push white supremacy narratives on fandom. If you could just act, you don't have to blatantly say this is racist. Even just something like, I don't understand what you mean by that coded word for racism. Like, what do you mean by this is too woke? What is political correctness? Like, that kind of thing can help people like us a lot, because a lot of times they may not listen to anybody like us saying things, but they see another white person not chiming in and agreeing with them, because a lot of times silence equals it's okay for me.
Agreement.
Yeah. Silence equals agreement. If I don't get this, can you cite a source? I don't remember reading that in my class. Stuff like that shakes them off their guard. And then they have to, you can see sometimes the circles they try to make in their mind to try to justify what they're trying to say, Things like that can help. And also too, if you're a member of a group that is an Austen, like if you're an Austen group that's a more official capacity, look at your guest list for your events. Look who are you paying for speakers? What kind of events are you hosting? Are you including people within your own communities? Like, because I'm not a member of JASNA, but I've noticed that some JASNA groups are trying to change. And there's also some events where it's the same old, white facing things that people aren't buying into just because it's not relevant to those, to people of color or even younger audiences. Like, there's only so many times you guys can have a tea party, or you folks can have a tea party, those are great, but then like you have to diversify your own spaces in terms of, especially if you are in charge of programming or anything like that, because oftentimes in event planning, it's who you know, not what you know. So instead of asking your cousins to do the same thing over and over again, try to find some new folks for your programming or events, and online pushing back against those narratives. And if people are not willing to learn, you may have to make the decision to cut them loose from your group. And don't think of it as I'm hurting my friend. What you're doing is you're making your group more viable for new people to join in.
I'm going to second that. And as a white lady with graying hair, I'm going to speak on behalf of and to other white ladies with graying hair. And I'm going to say a lot of people in my demographic, when we're confronted with, I mentioned some things earlier that people have made mistakes. I make mistakes frequently. I've made some recently, and it's really hard. And a lot of this feels like work. And in our spaces, it's made to feel like work. We are brought up in a society where we are not, there was a Twitter thread that went viral recently about how white women, especially, we're brought up to anything that's real talk is really scary, because we are meant to keep the peace. We need to have a clean house and quiet children. And anything outside of that is like, oh my God, it's a crisis. And I wasn't brought up that way, but this is sort of like the pillars of white womanhood. And that's not an excuse, but I understand it's scary to be told you screwed up, but take a moment, cry, take your breath, whatever, come back and do the work. And I think as we get more of these adaptations, more of these movies, more of these spaces where people are interacting with each other, it's going to get easier, and it's going to feel less like work. It's going to feel less like a confrontation when it's just normal. And that's the problem, though. Right now, getting there is on the backs of our friends who are women of color, and it needs to be on our back. Racism in communities of white women is the problem of the white women. There's a really good article that actually, like I said, I'm not that active. I follow a lot of stuff Bianca posts, and she posted this article by this Shakespeare scholar, and he had this thing about saying you're an ally just means like, oh, hey, I'm helping them with their work. That's not enough. Like, I'm an ally just means it's their job and I'm helping out. No, it's my job. It's my job to fix this. Like, it's not like, hey, women of color, fix my community, make it less racist. That's not right. Like, the racism comes from, it's in the house. Like, the phone call is coming from inside the house, you know. And when I'm in a Facebook group and another white woman comes in and says something, now let's say her intentions are in the right place, you know, there's a thing about, I remember reading a few years ago about, like, someone's harassing someone on the bus. I'm not going to go up to the harasser and get in their face and stuff. You know, you walk away with the person who's being harassed, and there are peaceful ways to diffuse a situation, but it's different online. Like you said, online, you know, there's ways to do it that take the focus off of putting that labor onto the people of color in the group. And I think it's really important for white women to learn those things. And if you have to do that in a separate space, you need to do that in a separate space. You don't need to do that on the back
Publicly.
Of right. And you don't need to do that. You don't, that's not, you know, there are all kinds of resources. Google is your friend. You don't need to go to Bianca. You don't need to go to Amanda and say, teach me how to do this. That's not their job. Someone has already done it. Go look it up. And then come back into that space with what you've learned. Because that mixed, shared space, those people are, again, this goes back to the thing, like, this is where they are to have joy. You know, it's not their job to fix your problems. It's not their job to fix racism. That's your job somewhere else. Stop crossing those boundaries. So I want to say that, please, white women especially, let's do better on that.
Everyone's learning, everyone's growing, everyone's evolving, and we're just human. Even if we make mistakes, we have misconceptions, and we learn, we ask questions, and as you know, we do Google a lot.
Absolutely. And it's not like you're a terrible person. And I think people sometimes, it's really scary. It's really scary when you screw up, especially publicly. But you're not a terrible person. We all do it. Just
consequence culture steps into, that's also scary. Cancel culture, consequence culture. It can be intimidating.
Yes.
I mean, but I mean, everyone, I mean, I've been trolled viciously for all kinds of things, you know. We all have, I'm sure. So that's another way to sort of, you know, create safe spaces online. Whether it's a forum or whether it's, say, Twitter, we have to sort of just be there for each other.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me here. I've learned so much, and I just love these conversations, because it just, being in this pandemic situation, if I don't have these types of things, I'm just typing away at my computer, work. I edited 13 books last year. That's the most. I can't even imagine doing that again. But I mean, if I don't have these types of things, that's all I'm going to do is work. So thank you.
No, this was wonderful for me. I mean, I'm just so blown away. I mean, of course, I've known all of you online, and Amy I've met in person. Remember Amy? When it was JASNA in DC 2 weeks before the elections.
Yes.
4.5 years ago. And actually I was asked, like, oh, you're not wearing a burqa. Remember?
No, I didn't ask you that.
Not you. They were like, oh, you're wearing a burqa. And I was like, sorry. Like, and one of the questions we were asked on the panel was like, does your government allow you to read books?
Yes, you were asked.
So I was like, well, we also not only read books, we're writing a book right now. So there was some confusion, which I was really happy to clear up. Yeah, I mean, but you know, everything is a Google search away. There's no excuse anymore. So we
also, like, part of accountability is like keeping your friends accountable too. And like, if you see people doing that, if you are a friend, or if you're in charge of an org, it is on you to, if you know better, to call that out. Like, you should. That's not cool. That's not okay at all. I'm sorry that you experienced that.
I was like stunned. No, I laughed. I mean, I cracked up. It's funny.
I mean, you can laugh. I think a lot of us can laugh about it because it's so ridiculous. But I also think, you know, at its core, that's a problem. That's a symptom of a bigger problem.
I mean, you can laugh it off, or you can get deeply offended. So it could have gone either way. I decided to laugh it off.
or both?
I was a bit like, okay.
Well, hopefully in 4 years that person has
there were a lot of
advanced
people
himself.
there were a lot of people like that. I would say maybe from smaller towns and.
Well,
Yeah.
like I said, I mean, I'm trying not to be like, you guys are like, oh, pandemic, I miss people. I'm like, oh, pandemic, great. I don't have to talk to people. I'm pretty antisocial because I have been exposed to a lot of people in my life who are, I mean, there's ignorance, like, because you genuinely don't know or weren't exposed to knowledge. And there's ignorance because you just don't care to know things. And this is America, and I'm just going to say that.
And you have the power in your hand right here. You have all the power in your hand.
Like
There's
you are
no excuse
literally
anymore.
online. So I don't know. Anyway,
So I think everybody here on this panel is helping to make the world a better place, whether it's entertaining people, offering insight, writing, editing, creating, dialogues, memes. I love memes. So yeah, I don't know if all of this is going to be included in the video or not, but yeah, I mean, once this is posted, I will reshare social media handles, and the topic is always open for discussion. So thank you so much, Bianca, Christina, Amanda, and Amy. Thank you so much for being here. That was lots of fun.
thank you for inviting me.
Thank
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is
Good to see
awesome.
these faces.
Hopefully we can meet in person.
Exactly.